So before we begin, I would just like to state for the record that today is June 3rd, 2022, and my name is Ben Bauman. I'm here in Indianapolis, Indiana, speaking via video chat with Brian Bosma, who is also located in Indianapolis, Indiana, and we are doing an interview for the Indiana Legislative Oral History Initiative. So just starting off, when and where were you born?
So I was born in Beech Grove on Halloween, October 31 in 1957.
Wow, okay.
My parents were very civic-minded individuals and placed a very high premium on public service, with Dad initially running for the mayor of Beech Grove in 59. Allegedly, I had a sandwich board on me in a parade that said, "Vote for my dad," at the age of 2. And Mom was a school teacher. He was ultimately elected to the General Assembly in 62, and then took a Barry Goldwater break with all the other Republicans in 1964, returned in 66 to the House, and then served in the Senate from 1968 to 1983.
Yeah, okay. So how did your family first get to Indiana?
So 3 of 4 of my grandparents were immigrants from my dad's parents from Holland, the Netherlands.
Yeah.
I'm sorry, my dad's dad from the Netherlands, and my dad's mom from Germany. And then both of my mom's parents from Germany. And Dad's family came over. There were 12 kids, 10 girls, 2 boys. And they came over in 1908, 9, and 10 after the family Bunderhaus road. They had a big hotel. Got 13 or 12 kids. You have to have a hotel to run for them to live in. And that burned in something like 1908. And they came over here in 2s and 3s. Ended up in Martinsville and Beech Grove, Indiana.
Wow. Okay. So
yeah, and then I'm not sure about my mom's parents. Early part of the 20th century, also for them to come over.
Okay. Cool. Now, did you have any siblings growing up?
I did. I had 2 older sisters, Janice, who was 10 years older than me, born in 47. My dad was overseas. Met my mom in Colorado Springs at Fort Carson. They got pinned before he left for the European theater.
Yeah.
And returned, got married, drug her back to Beech Grove, crying the whole way, she says, because of the mountain, not missing the mountains. And and then I had my eldest sister, Jim, in 47, and Rhonda in 50. Janice has passed away. Rhonda is married to a surgeon and lives out in Annapolis, Maryland.
Okay.
Well, Jan was single all her life and lived right here in Indianapolis.
Okay, interesting. All right. So how would you describe your childhood then, looking back?
Lots of hard work. We owned a dairy and a retail dairy store and a soda fountain type of dairy store all on Main Street, Beech Grove. The farm and dairy plant were not on Main Street, but so from the time of 7 on, I was employed by the family business and did everything from packing ice to ice cream and waiting on customers in the drive-through dairy store and washing dishes in the ice cream shop. And it's kind of like a brazier, we had a grill and all that kind of stuff. So yeah, a lot of hard work, but happy family. As I mentioned, my parents both placed a high premium on public service. And I mean, dinner table discussion with my parents and my sisters was, what was going on in the world, what was going on in our state and our city, and how we needed to be involved to help. Spirit-led family as well. Parents were deeply committed Lutherans, and church every Sunday, and lots of times on Wednesday night too. Mom ended up being a teacher at the school. It's over in Fountain Square now.
Oh wow!
And
okay.
So good family, happy upbringing, lots of work. There was no idle time. I played basketball in high school and junior high. And once I had my driver's license, one of my jobs was to clean the dairy bar, which was a pretty big facility, before the morning basketball practice. So either that or after they closed at 10 o'clock the prior night. So yeah, plenty of work, but pleasant, lots of fun too.
Yeah. Okay. Jeez.
So spent a lot of time in the woods. We had 5 acres behind our house that were woods, and so we just spent a lot of time out there building forts and playing army and throwing dirt clods at each other and cutting trails, building tree houses. A lot of fun.
Awesome. All right. And so were your parents the most influential people in your childhood, you would say then?
Yeah, there's no doubt about that. My dad especially, I worked with him in addition to him being my father, just my boss.
Yeah.
So we spent a lot of time together. He was a no-nonsense guy. There's not a lot of kidding around. He actually was hospitalized with shell shock after the war. He was a witness at several of the death camps, and I think that he was in artillery, so both the shelling and that experience profoundly affected him throughout his life. So he was super smart, very serious guy.
Yeah.
But no doubt he taught me the value of hard work, applying myself, the need for public service. He was fond of saying that this country's been so wonderful to our family, we need to give back.
Yeah.
Both his parents were immigrants, so and he was the firstborn of his big family in the country here, so he pressed that on us.
Sure.
My mom was milder and soft-spoken, but could wipe a kid's nose in kindergarten. She was a kindergarten teacher, and then go to dinner with the governor and the governor's wife that evening, as my dad served in the legislature. So, they're no doubt the most influential, and my sisters too. I was the kid brother, so
Yeah, that's right.
I got a little fawning, but also a lot of pounding. Not pounding, but kidding.
Yeah,
So
right.
had to be able to take it.
Naturally, yeah.
How would you describe your educational experiences then growing up?
Yeah, strong. I was, a top student, not the top student at Beech Grove High School, and had some scholarships, not certainly a kind of full ride, but some scholarship assistance based on academics at Purdue University, where I obtained my engineering degree. I took so many political science classes and history classes along the way that was a 5-year program instead of 4.
Yep.
Fortunately, met my wife there as well. And then after graduation from Purdue School of Engineering, I went to what is now IU McKinney, then was Indiana University School of Law in Indianapolis. And I struggled a little bit in engineering school, mostly because I was not as dedicated a student as I was to campus activities and a job, and I was in student government and involved with church. But I was still in the top 20% of my major. I excelled at in law school and did very well there, and worked full time during law school as well.
Sure.
But good. All Indiana, all good experience. Great school, was parochial, Emmaus Lutheran, where my mom taught, so I had to behave.
Right.
So good all Indiana education.
Yeah.
Wish I would have taken stronger advantage of it now when I look back, and maybe applied myself in undergraduate a little more strongly, but had a broad background of engineering and humanities, which has served me well, in both in the political realm and in my professional career as well.
Yeah, no, that makes perfect sense. So how did you view Indiana growing up as a state? I mean, obviously your father was, in the General Assembly for several years, so that would have probably helped you have more of an understanding than most people growing up.
I had a strong sense of public service. I met Ronald Reagan when he came here and gave the speech in which he wanted to hand hand power back to the states, the federalism speech that he made in the floor of the Indiana House.
Yeah.
So, I grew up, I'd answer the phone at home as a kid and I'd say something stupid like, Joe's barbershop when my parents were gone, and said, this is Governor Whitcomb and Senator Bosma. So, I'm sorry, Governor. So, I had an opportunity to meet a lot of public servants as well, top leaders in the state growing up. And I had a very positive view of the state. Of course, as a young person, you didn't have to worry about taxes or, for me, employment, because there was more employment than I could possibly handle in the family business. Sure. So generally, I felt the state was a great place to grow up and for our family to be raised.
Yeah. Now, when you went off to college, did you have a kind of a little bit of a change in your awareness of politics? Did you get more interested in it?
Not so much.
Okay.
I was involved in college Republicans. In fact, about 8 months ago, the guy that was the president of the college Republicans said he just found a bunch of photos, and he sent a picture of me and with little big full head of hair, and Dan Quayle when he was running for his first election, and it was funny. So I was certainly aware. My dad ran for Congress in 1978.
Okay.
So I took some time out of school. I didn't disenroll or anything like that, but I was home a lot working with him, knocking on doors and doing things. So I probably had a healthy awareness, more so than your average college student. And I was involved in campus politics as well. And so, I was more aware than your average person by far.
Sure.
And then in law school, became involved in Marion County and ended up creating a Young Republicans Club in Lawrence Township in the Northeast Side that got to be big enough that we hosted the state convention, and so I was fully engulfed by politics in law school, and then after graduation, just by 2 years, ran for the General Assembly myself.
Yeah. Okay. Neat. When did you get married?
So Cheryl and I were married the second year of law school in 1983. Ironically, I dated her cousin in high school and hadn't really met Cheryl. Cousin was a couple years younger than I was, so when I was up at Purdue, it didn't work out. And then the cousin's mom, Cheryl's aunt, said, "Oh, you have to meet my niece up at Purdue. She'll be a freshman next year." When I was a sophomore, so she's got a great personality. And okay, well, I'll put that in the list of girls with great personalities. And then I was walking into the student government offices, and Purdue at the time printed up a thing they called the freshman register, and it was all freshman senior pictures in it. So, and you'd be shocked to know that the guys would pore over this and try to pick out who, and I stick my head over and literally somebody says, "Look at that," and I said, "Cheryl Hollingsworth, that's the girl with the great personality." So I called Cheryl up. I was the little sister rush chairman at our fraternity. Okay. And, I could still give the speech. It's not a dating program. Well, it was a dating program, pretty much so. But I called and invited Cheryl. It refreshed her memory who I was, and I dated her cousin, and her aunt had mentioned that we should, meet, and invited her to a party. And she shows up with 9 friends, I think probably as bodyguards. And so my joke is we pledged them all as little sisters. So, that's how we met and dated all through college. And I will tell you, they had somebody come in law school my freshman year. I'm babbling, so if this gets too far off.
No, you're totally fine.
Yeah. And gave this, who'd gone through some kind of nasty divorce or something. And this is at orientation. And he says, "Look to your left and look to your right. If you're married, one of this, or 2 of the 3 of you won't be married when you're out of law school." And I'm like, "Gee." So I kind of pushed out our marriage timing for a year, and she was finally, we got to do something here. We call it the ultimatum.
Right.
So she's like, we're either going to get married or I'm moving on. And I'm like, oh, we're getting married. So we were married in, I said 83, it was actually 1982.
Okay.
And which was my second year of law school. 40 years this year. So she's put up with quite a bit.
Congratulations. Yeah, that's
thanks.
Cool.
Trying to decide what to do for it.
Yeah, that's right. It's a big deal. So now, how many children do you have?
We have 2 adult children. Allison was born in 1988. Mm-hmm. Christopher born in 1991.
Okay.
Allison is in Scotland at the moment. She and her husband on a little vacation. But she is a teacher at a parochial elementary school in Fort Collins, Colorado. Her husband's a CPA almost. And then Christopher is he is doing his medical residency at IU here in Indianapolis. Oh, okay. He met his wife when they were both doing medical mission work down in Haiti. She's from Carmel, of all things. And they've been married for a while now, and 6 years maybe, and have adopted a little guy who just turned a year old. So
cool. Wow.
So we're grandparents. So great kids, awesome. Really awesome kids. That's probably Cheryl left work as soon as Allison was born. She worked for AT&T, and while I lamented it at the time because of the finances, because I was still a student. No, I guess I was I was out of school. But we went from 2 incomes to 1, and I lamented that, but it was probably the best decision we ever made. They're both great kids, just fantastic contributors to the community.
Yeah, that's perfect. So how did you first decide to get seriously involved in politics like your dad?
Yeah, that's difficult to say. I guess I recently had a high school reunion, and I saw in my, we had to do a self-fulfilling prediction of some sort. And I said I was going to go to Purdue, get an engineering degree, get a law degree, meet a beautiful blonde, and run for governor. So it must have been on my, almost all of that is true.
I guess, yeah.
So it must have been on my mind even in high school. It didn't really formulate itself into action until, and as a kid, I worked on all kinds of campaigns. I hung door mailers for Dick Lugar when he ran for mayor.
Yeah.
For governor candidates, would do walking volunteer stuff, mostly because my dad said, hey, we're going to go. But, I always enjoyed it and met a lot of people that I still know today through those activities. So it didn't really become solid until law school that I knew I was going to, in some fashion, run for office.
Sure. Yeah, it makes sense. And so when you first decided to run for the General Assembly, what was your campaign strategy? What was going through your head? Yeah.
So Marion County's kind of different. Marion County at the time, it was, I'd say, special because it was a Republican county, had a very strong Republican organization. They went through a process called slating, in which precinct committeemen endorsed candidates for the primary. Mm-hmm. And because of I figured out that I was recruited to get involved in the Lawrence Young Republicans and be the president of it by folks who were dissatisfied with the then state representative for the area, which is up on the northeast. Actually, it was the entire east side at the time, and they were grooming me to run against him in 1986. So I actually went through the slating. They again suggested strongly that I file my candidacy for slating, which I wasn't like I was reluctant to do so. I was anxious to do so and did. And then this individual, Gordon Harper was his name, who had served maybe for 10 years, dropped out before the primary, dropped out in February when slating occurred. And then so I was selected by the precinct committeeman to fill the vacancy as of May 10th, 1986, and I immediately changed from committee to elect to committee to re-elect in November. So, because I technically served for 6 months prior to the election.
Wow.
And, oddly, I don't have it on me, but I came across a campaign flyer for that year. It may be here in the office someplace. I had it at the State House that, had my picture with this giant head of hair, glamour shot, and Brian Bosma. And then the items that I said I stood for were balanced budget, school choice for every family, revived economy in our state, positive tax incentives and levels for businesses to operate, and a few other items. Ironically, when I became the speaker Republican leader in 2020, I started doing an agenda every year, and that's very common now, but nobody was doing an agenda. No legislative group was doing an agenda then. And I came across, doing some office clean out, and came across one from 2002, which was the Right Track Indiana plan. Okay. And I've got them from every year that we ran, not just when we ran, but actually every legislative session. Wow. We had a written agenda as to what we would accomplish, and all those things that were on that initial list were all accomplished. There might have been one that didn't make sense in retrospect, but I'm pretty consistent on all of those things over the years.
Right. That's interesting.
Which surprised me a little bit.
Yeah, well,
it's like I knew what I stood for today. I just didn't realize I stood for it in 1986.
Right. Yeah, that's true. Plenty of time for things to change if they were to.
Yeah. Yep.
Now, what was your family's reaction when you told them that you wanted to run for the General Assembly?
Well, there was no surprise to anyone. First of all, my dad had passed away 3 years earlier.
Okay.
And I had even contemplated running to fill the vacancy in his Senate seat, but did not live in the district, and that was a requirement at the time.
Okay.
So he passed in *83 while I was still in law school. And no one in my family, including my wife, was surprised in the least that I was going to be a candidate. My mom was thrilled. She was saving stuff for the Brian Bosma Museum from my childhood, my mom. So she was exceptionally thrilled. In fact, until she became unable to do so, she kept very detailed scrapbooks for me. And I have them dating from, really 84, but 86 when I started serving, probably through 2018, she started to become less capable of clipping. Actually, it's probably before that, probably about 2017.
Okay.
But I mean, I went back and looked at them for a few things, and it's pretty darn detailed and chronological. So,
wow.
Pretty much so all coverage, any news coverage or discussion in any of the political rags, that kind of thing that I would say. She posted it. I got boxes of stuff since she was no longer able to do it. 2016ish, I guess, probably. So.
Sure.
I'll get it organized at some point.
There you go. Do you remember your main opponent?
In which year?
Their first year that you ran for.
Yeah, there were several people that appeared before Slating. I think Tom Morant was one who went on to be a good friend and Warren Township trustee later. I really can't recall who else, but it was a contested Slating. But when you've been groomed by the party to be there,
right?
It was not too serious. And then Slating continued until probably 2018. I think it was discontinued, and I didn't have any opponents in Slating in that 30 after the first time, the 34-year period. I did have some strong general election challenges, especially when I became speaker, because the part of the strategy, legislative campaign strategy, is to keep the leadership busy, and that makes them the leaders, the caucus leaders generally also run the campaigns around the state.
Right.
So if you can keep the leader busy at home, it makes it more difficult for him or her to raise money and coordinate campaigns around the state. So yeah, I had 3 or 4 fairly serious challenges. Most were supported by the State Teachers Association. I was never their poster child. I was their poster child, but not on the good poster, because of school choice and some other advocacies. Despite my huge support for teachers, Cheryl and I have 15 teachers in our immediate family, including our daughter, both our moms, both retired, of course, but many more. So there were several that were strong. None of them close because of the district. They got closer as time went on because the portion of my district in Marion County has turned from red to blue.
Okay.
But the portions of Hancock and Hamilton County that I had over the years, of course, were at the time very red, and so there was nothing close, but I couldn't ignore it either.
Sure. Yeah, I understand. So what did you think of like the election process then when you were first running? What was it like? Did you enjoy the process, or was there issues with it? Or
I can't identify any issues. Yeah, I always did enjoy it. I would make a point to. So again, Marion County is just a little bit different. Part of the process was to attend a lot of Republican meetings. There were probably 4 of those a month.
Yeah.
For different. Back when I had 4 townships in the district, I was actually elected the first time to a multi-member district that had three representatives in it. Those were abolished in the 1991 reapportionment. So you had to go to the Franklin Township Republican Club and the Warren Township Republican Club and the Lawrence Township Republican Club, the Center Township Republican Club, in addition to the other campaign things that you had to do. So it kept you busy. But Cheryl and I love people. Cheryl was, side by side. If you didn't show up with your wife, people would wonder. So, where's Brian's wife? Where's Cheryl? So you had to get dragged along to most of those as well at the start. And so I enjoyed, we both enjoyed tremendously meeting people. It can get old when there's so many meetings, but we enjoyed it the whole way through. And the election process itself, always good for us. Now, as the chairman of the House Republican Campaign Committee for 20 years, I saw a lot of issues. Some I probably have funded more election recounts than any person in our state's history.
Yeah.
Starting with Jim Adderholt in the north side of Indianapolis district back in 88, might have been 90. And, there's some really close elections around the state. But we put together a very different type of campaign team, a professional campaign team, and kept them. And consequently ended up with a big super majority.
Sure.
Maybe more than is comfortable to try to work with.
Yeah.
So, success has its positives and sometimes its negatives.
Yeah, that's an interesting aspect of it, because I wonder if if you get so much of a super majority, then you start to wonder if the parties are shifting where you're going to have 2 different Republican parties almost.
Exactly. About 56. I've been in everything from a 48 Republican, 52 Democrat minority to 71 Republican majority, and I'd say about and everything in between, 56, 52, 60, 50-50 twice. Pick your number, and I'd say 56 is about the sweet spot. I tell people, because we just had 52 in my first speakership in 2005 and 2006, and if one person is not going to vote with you, then everybody is the 51st vote. And if it's not a overly popular provision like leasing the toll road in northern Indiana or adopting daylight savings time, then every person who voted for it is the 51st vote, and that's a campaign mailer against them.
Pressure,
Yeah,
that's interesting.
Yeah, but I have no beefs about the electoral process. I think Indiana runs good elections. There in that Jim Adderholt election, there were actually in one precinct there were more votes cast than registered voters.
Okay.
So, but it was an all African American precinct, or virtually all African American precinct, and we had to make the decision: are we going to try to throw out all the votes of African Americans in this portion of District 86 or not? And the decision was, well, that'd be a terrible precedent.
Sure.
And poorly received, so we didn't. So, is there some fraud in the election process? Yes, of course there is. I disagree with those in prominent positions that say, the elections are stolen or there's massive fraud everywhere. I disagree with that concept, and it just isn't the case. Are there events? Are there votes that are cast fraudulently? Absolutely.
Yeah.
We contested one in southeastern Indiana where a guy was actually convicted. A Democrat was actually convicted of fraudulently collecting 2,000 votes.
Wow.
So yeah, for those who say there's no fraud, they're also not right.
Right.
But it's not so prevalent that it's throwing national elections or even statewide elections one way or the other. Legislative district, it could happen.
Yeah. Interesting. So when you first got elected, what was your reaction to winning your first ever election in the General Assembly?
Well, it was a little anticlimactic because I was already serving, right? I had 6 months under my belt. I actually served on a committee or two as well. So it wasn't perhaps as climactic as it might be for someone who, had never been around it. Oh, I left one thing out. I was also, after graduating from law school, I practiced law for about a year, and then I was hired by the superintendent of public instruction, H. Dean Evans, and who was selected to fill that role when the former superintendent of public instruction was discovered he was running his campaigns out of the State House with State House employees. So I had spent 2 sessions, a long session and a very short session, at the State House as my job. And so again, I became very well acquainted with the process, became somewhat of an expert on education issues due to working with him. And so again, it was anticlimactic for me because I'd been around it. I grew up in the building, visiting with my dad. I got caught up in the dome. I'm looking at the dome right now. I got caught up in the dome by the workers there when I was down there paging for my dad, and a door was open that had a circular staircase all the way up that I took. So I knew the place very well, and so it was, I wanted to work. I wanted to work for Hoosiers, and I wasn't that excited about the hoopla surrounding the election. Really.
Sure. Yeah. So when you were elected, did you feel like then you're kind of like carrying on your dad's legacy then?
Yeah, there's no doubt there was a good bit of that, and a lot of the people that were there still had served with my dad.
Yeah.
Who had just been there 3 years before when he passed away in office, and had a prominent role in the Indiana Senate. He was the assistant to the president pro tem. So Bob Garton, who ultimately I became the Republican leader, still with Bob when Bob was still the president of the Senate. And I always thought and when we crossed straws, which we did quite frequently, I always thought well, this kid that used to page for my friend is running the show over there. And but found out that I wasn't a pushover on things. So it was good. I got thrown hip deep right away into finance and education and environment. Those were my 3 areas. My law practice at the time focused on environmental matters, and then which was the first major education reform in Indiana in 50 years, and ultimately became a co-sponsor of the bill in the 87 session, my first full session. And so I was, I was all about, and I served on Ways and Means. So I was all about getting the job done and doing it well for Hoosiers, and carrying on the family name and legacy as well, of course.
Yeah.
Which I never felt I did. My dad was the quote conscience of the Senate, and was just really a really well respected guy. And so, but it was actually the last 2 years had been the first years, with the exception of 2, in the last 60 years that Bosma was not serving in the General Assembly.
Wow. Yeah, that's crazy to think about. Yeah.
Yeah.
Jeez. I guess. Yeah. Maybe. One of your kids are going to have to go in and serve. And.
They both would be fantastic. Our daughter has said never, and our son is too busy trying to save the medical world.
Okay.
Save the world from their medical problems. So maybe someday.
Maybe, yeah. Yeah, they have to wait until grandkids or something. Yeah.
Yeah, maybe.
Now I'm gonna backtrack a little bit. What legislation was it? The name kind of got caught out because of pros for a second.
It was the A+ program for educational excellence.
Okay.
It was the largest tax increase in state history, adding 3 or 4% to the not 3 or 4%, but taking the income tax from 3% to 3.4%, raising something like at the time $300 or $400 million, adding 5, maybe 10 days to the education year.
Yep.
All right, we had the shortest school year in the nation. Implementing uniform testing. We did not have a I-step test at that point, so you couldn't tell if somebody was making progress or not. And had teacher incentives and awards, school awards. It was a massive program. And Dean Evans was a highly respected educator and been the superintendent of Washington Township School System, and had a very strong opinion about how to improve education, and it included charter schools and education choice as well. So these were all things that I kind of learned at his side, and then was able to be one of the key sponsors of the legislation in '87. So it was a big challenge. A lot of people involved in it, so it wasn't just me. But it was an early positive achievement for the state, and for me legislatively too.
Yeah. Okay. Now, when you got into the General Assembly, I presume that you probably didn't have you didn't probably have as big of a learning curve as other people, because your dad's experiences and everything going on.
And I hung around the halls, in the chamber and in committees for 2 years or 2 sessions.
Yeah.
With Dr. Evans, and so my learning curve was low, and the Republican leadership knew it too. So they put me in. Paul Manwaller was the speaker at the time. He put me in some key roles and gave me some assignments that didn't normally go to the freshmen.
Yeah.
And it was because both family experience and personal experience in working with Dean.
Sure. Okay. And how did you keep track of the needs and wants of your constituents over the years?
You're out there. When you go to all these meetings, for starters, people talk to you about what's important. As a member of Ways and Means, everybody under the sun testifies as to what they think money ought to be spent on, and reforms ought to occur. That was one of the criticisms of my predecessor in that district, is he never went to anything.
Okay.
Didn't listen to anybody.
Yeah.
And so, I can tell you in my later years, I was a less adamant attender at local.
Right.
I had statewide responsibility as the Speaker of the House, and then campaign responsibility for everybody, not just myself. But early on, for 10, 15 years, that was where you were, and you went to dinners and meetings and neighborhood association meetings, and people let you know what was on their mind, whether you wanted to hear it or not. So, and frequently, and constituents reach out too. I had another one of my early bills, it might have been that first year also, was to remove parental rights from imprisoned, convicted rapists.
Interesting. Okay.
At the time, I should say convicted, not whether they were imprisoned or not.
Right.
There was a family that came to me and they wanted to have, they did not want to have visitation rights and wanted to put a child up for adoption that had been conceived in rape, and the individual had been convicted of rape.
Right.
He still had parental rights under Indiana law. There was no exception for that.
Okay.
So, again, that was, I don't know if that was a phone call or a letter somebody wrote to me, and probably a letter, and said they needed help, and you get together with them and put together a proposal. A lot of times, that's where honestly where a lot of legislation comes from. I'd say a quarter or more is from constituent outreach to their local representative or senator.
Yeah.
Another quarter probably come from lobby organizations, maybe more than that. Maybe a half comes from lobby organizations, and then a quarter comes from either independent thought of the legislator who hasn't been contacted by anybody, or a product of summer study committees, that kind of thing.
Mm-hmm.
So that's one great thing. People are saying, "Oh, don't you want to go to Congress? Don't you want to go to Congress?" No. For starters, I didn't want to live in Washington, D.C., but you can really impact people's lives as a legislator, because we're in session for a couple of months, 4 maybe in long sessions, and then you're in your community.
Right.
You're at your place of business. You're at your church or synagogue on Saturday.
Yeah.
And you're out amongst them. So, as one of my colleagues used to say, I got to get out amongst them.
Yeah. That makes sense.
And people don't hesitate to. This is back before social media, where people would post their beefs online. People didn't hesitate to approach you and say, "Hey, look, I got a real problem," or "Why did you vote this way?
Right.
What are you thinking? Why are you so conservative? Why aren't you conservative enough?" Whatever it may be, they've got an opinion and they're sharing it.
Yeah, that's interesting. I mean, did you do a lot of like door-to-door campaigning over the years, or?
In some years, when they posted a strong opponent that was going door to door. One year they had a gal that was on the Lawrence Township School Board, whose name escapes me again, funded by the State Teachers Association.
Yeah.
And they had a little mini bus all decorated up for her, and they would get a bunch of State Teachers Association and other folks who didn't particularly care for me, one fashion or another, volunteer to go door to door. So you had to do some of that, but I didn't honestly do a lot.
Okay.
Between mailing and media, there's so many ways to contact people. People are impressed when somebody comes to their door. They're also impressed when somebody comes to their door and leaves a mailer that's been signed by the candidate, whether it was the candidate that put it there or not.
Yeah.
So you can have volunteers help with a lot of things as well.
Yeah. I imagine also going door to door, you never know whose door you're going to go to. It could be an interesting situation.
It could be extremely interesting. In fact, there was one time when Cheryl and I were going door to door, and this is, maybe 8 years. This is the State Teachers Association candidate. And we're going door to door, not too far from our house. And I'm walking up. There's a guy outside, and I said, "Excuse me, sir. I know who you are. Don't you come on my property." I said, "Okay, thank you. Appreciate your vote, but
wow.
Bye." Yeah.
Wow. Okay. Yikes. Okay. Wow. Jeez. Yep. Especially if it's
a lot
close
of people
to
are gracious too. A lot of people are very gracious. Thanks for your service. That kind of thing.
Right. Yeah. Okay. Interesting. Yep. Did you ever find it like challenging to get support for a bill at all, or did you kind of?
Sure. You have to, So I talked about our agenda items. Those were the bills that I, later in my career as a leader, from 2000 on, my last nearly 20 years in the General Assembly, most of my focus was on our mutually agreed upon agenda bills, which as a general rule, I came up with the ideas for.
Yeah.
And then I would sometimes, if they're very important, like charter schools and school choice in 2011, I would author them myself or co-author them. Right to Work in 2012, I co-authored with Representative Jerry Torr. The major road funding of 2018, which included a 10-cent gas tax increase, I co-authored. So that was where my last 20 years, that was where my primary focus was, on those agenda bills and being sure that our agenda bills work through the process properly and were adopted into law.
Yeah, sure. Now, what was the first bill that you ever sponsored?
I'm going to say it was the one that I was the principal author of.
Yeah.
The first one I remember was the parental rights removal for convicted felons.
Yep.
Convicted of rape, and the child was a product of the rape.
Right.
That's the first one I can remember. I could look back and maybe come up with something else. Another one that I remember very fondly wasn't my first by any means, but it was in 1994. I co-authored an early school choice bill, and that was when school choice was just being talked about around the country. And we were way ahead of the curve. Didn't get it through till 2012, but 1994, that was an early effort as well. I think in '88, perhaps, I was can't remember if I was primary author or primary sponsor. So author is if it's a bill in your house, sponsor is if it's in the other house. So I was either the primary author or primary sponsor of the Kids First license plate. That was the first license plate that somebody could pay $25 extra for, and it would go into a special fund. And this was for kids that had been abused and neglected, and a special fund for them. So that was an early effort also in 1988.
Yeah. Okay. Sure. How often did you have to work with the other party to get legislation done? I guess it depended on the year, of course, but
yeah, almost always. So about half of my career was spent in the minority. Half of my 34 years was spent in the minority, or 50-50.
Yeah.
So you had to work. First of all, you didn't have any authority, so you had to could only get something done through the other side. But I was always a strong advocate of bipartisanship. In, let's see, my second session, or my second election, 1988, we were 50-50. And literally my best friends at the legislature were Democrats. It was John Gregg, it was Mark Carmichael, who recently represented the beer distributors. It was Mark Cruzan, who went on to be the mayor of Bloomington. Mark and I, this is another early effort, in 1988, were the co-authors of the state's Underground Storage Tank Cleanup Act. So, and we were hand in hand on that. When we ultimately got into a big majority under my speakership, I remember telling the caucus, and I told them every session, that with, people were like, yeah, we got a supermajority, we can do whatever we want to do. And I lectured them really that a supermajority requires more cooperation, better communication, and more bipartisan outreach. So it's just the opposite of what you think. It's not, we don't need to worry about those guys walking out. We need to be sure everyone has had the opportunity to participate. And the fellow that was speaker before me was not fond of following the rules.
Okay.
and wasn't fond of letting people speak that had opinions differing from his. So, which frequently focused on me as the minority leader, not being allowed to speak or make a motion or whatever it may be.
Mm-hmm.
And I vowed to my caucus and ultimately to the body, if elected the speaker and when elected the speaker, I would be very inclusive. And I kept that promise, allowing something like 7 hours of debate on the lease of the toll road in 2005 and similar long periods of debate, which would never have happened before, giving everybody an opportunity to speak without being interrupted.
Yeah.
Savings time and some of the other school choice, some of the other large initiatives. Oh, right to work. That one went for hours.
Yeah.
But I told my team it's important that we let everyone have their say and then win.
Right.
We've got the votes, but let them speak and don't interrupt them. I mean, if somebody gets way off topic, and then the speaker has to step in. But I vowed to be inclusive, and I have recently had some Democrats that have come across, excuse me, at various functions say, "Boy, did we miss you. We didn't understand. You were trying to protect the institution and the members and give us all a shot at participating. Boy, did we miss you."
Wow.
You guys couldn't say that while I was there, I suppose.
Yeah, things change, I guess. Yeah.
I guess.
So what were the interactions like overall throughout your career from the 80s to, when you left in terms of the relationship between Democrats and Republicans?
Yeah, they changed.
Okay.
I used to say that it was like old time championship wrestling, which predates you, but there was a championship wrestling. It became ultimately, all superseded by the WWF or whatever they are now.
Right.
But there was a local championship wrestling syndicate, and then they had them all over the Midwest. Dick the Bruiser and the Sultan and all these guys. I used to watch it with my grandma, who was a fan. And I used to say it was like championship wrestling. Everybody comes out and beats on each other, and then goes back in the locker room and has a beer together.
Right.
About the kids, that kind of thing. And it was like that at the start of my legislative career. The 250-50s changed that exceptionally. That's what I blame it on, the 250-50 splits, because people were discouraged from hanging out together, kind of keep with your Democrat or Republican team. Especially the second one around. The first one was in 88. The second one was like, I don't remember when the second one was. 96 maybe. But that I saw a distinct change.
Yeah.
And the other thing that makes it difficult is the campaigns can be so nasty.
Yeah. Okay. Sure.
The mailers, and commercials that are done they can hurt people.
Yeah.
And they bring that animosity back with them to the process. So when I was in charge of the campaigns for 20 years, I made our guys run by the nasty stuff by me, because they didn't care, because they're political consultants. They don't have to serve with anybody. They just want to win an election. They'll throw bombs and say this guy's a bum and a cheat and everything else. And so, but you don't have to work with them. I'm gonna, after the election, if they aren't beaten, I got to work with them. So they sneaked a couple by me, but that I think that's probably one of the most difficult areas for people to heal from. They take it personally. There's one lady legislator, ex-legislator, that I tried to get to switch parties because she was a very conservative individual, and gave her every opportunity to do that. And then, the team beat her in the election with pointing out her votes and her walkout to Illinois and all the things that she didn't want people to have front of mind as they voted. And she still is, when I come across her, she's still not very friendly. Okay. So those things can hurt people. And it's contact sport. whether people like that or not. It's a contact sport today. So
Yeah, that's interesting. So it just seems like over time, then, and I've heard a lot of, I guess, former legislators echo this now, that it just things got more and more aggressive.
yeah, well, so much was on the line and it was so close.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah. Interesting.
Back in the day, hasn't been now for 10 years, but
Yeah.
it was so close prior to that and went back and forth so many times. The other thing I told our caucus when we had this 70-30 supermajority, I had our staff go back and look at all the supermajorities in the past, and there was one, I can't remember the year. It was around maybe Civil War. No, it was around Prohibition.
Okay.
And it was 96 Republicans to 4 Democrats. And whatever the Republicans did, the next year it was like 80-20 Democrat.
Wow.
So yeah, so it was this huge swing, and I think it surrounded alcohol, and prohibition.
Okay. Yeah.
And I used that as just an example to people about having to work together, having more communication, more cooperation, more inclusion rather than less. Because as John Gregg used to say, the worm can turn.
Mm-hmm. So by the time you were leaving, do you have, or I mean, I guess at this point you'll see like a few years out now, but do you have hope for that things will become a little bit less aggressive, or do you think that we're going to be still in the kind of aggressive era of politics for the time being?
I'm not sure it's ever been non-aggressive. I mean,
right.
If you look back at about the Jefferson Adams campaign and the horrible things that reporters said about each other.
Right.
Different medium. It was just a newspaper was all that was available at the time. But I don't know that it's never been gentle. We think about it. We have this stylized view that it was a gentleman's game. It never has been really, but it would be. And I think social media has multiplied that exponentially. Because people will gladly say something online that they would never say to a person's face.
Right. Yes. Social media is pretty insane. Yeah.
Yeah. So I don't know. I mean, I think I'm fond of saying the Republic will survive. When somebody says it's the end of it, the Republic will survive. I've become somewhat less convinced of that over the last couple of years on a federal level.
Okay.
But Indiana's in good hands. It's been in good hands under Republicans and Democrats, whether I've agreed with their approach or their policies on the other side. Everybody, almost everybody is there because they want to make Indiana a better place, not because they want to screw Indiana up.
Right.
So now their policies may have that effect, theirs or ours. May have that effect, but that's not their intent.
Right.
Everybody wants to make, do their best to make Indiana a better place to live.
Makes sense. I guess analyzing a different dynamic, what was the relationship between the House and Senate when you served?
That's interesting. Early in my leadership, as I indicated, I was the Republican leader 2000 to 2004, then the Speaker 2004 through 2006. And Bob Garton was the Senate leader at that time. Things in Indiana were about where Bob wanted them because he had been the longest serving president pro tem of the Senate, pretty much so reigned over the legislative process. And I had a lot of reform ideas that he did not agree with, such as repealing lifetime legislative health care, which I did administratively in 2006, after begging Bob to do it as well. And he was beat in the subsequent primary, and really by fellow Republicans that were upset about he'd stopped gaining from moving forward. But they beat him over the head with that lifetime legislative health care thing, and the Speaker of the House repealed it, and you didn't. He's kind of always blamed me for his defeat. So with Bob, things were not as smooth. Again, because he'd known me since I was 10.
Yeah.
I always thought he viewed me as, his friend's page kid, and not as an adult leader of the Indiana House or Republican caucus of the House. So I would say they were fair. We did not have any joint agenda type of items. We rarely had joint press conferences together, although we did have some with Mitch. Now, then Bob left and David Long became the Senate President pro tem. He and I had an extremely good relationship. In fact, I think it was probably the best relationship, at least in institutional memory, between the House and Senate leader and our governor, which was Mitch at the time.
Okay.
Like subsequent, and not that we didn't disagree, we did, but we would treat each other with respect and try to help each other where we could. There's lots of crazy ideas that come out of both chambers, and which the leaders don't want. The leaders don't want the headline to be Crazy Bill A. They want their agenda to be the headline. So we worked together to sidetrack a lot of those things. And we worked together for 10 or 12 years, I guess. So we became good friends. I just texted him a couple of days ago. But that was cultivated over a decade. That kind of relationship was cultivated over a decade or more. And it probably doesn't exist at the moment, not because the people aren't capable of doing it. They certainly are. It's just that, they're both the speaker and the president pro tem have, a few years under their belt, both of them, and weren't able to see all the behind the scenes things that leaders were able to do, for 20 years. Really.
Sure. Yeah. Okay. Now, how influential was party leadership to dictating which legislation makes it through?
To us?
Just in general, if it gets, to you
Yeah, we took no instructions from either party leadership, frequently not from the governor. So the legislative leadership in both chambers is, in my experience, the driving force for what legislation passes and what does not. Now, that does not mean you don't work with your party leadership. And I can only speak about the Republican Party leadership.
Yeah.
It was a rare occasion when somebody came to me and said, we have to have something. One was that they came to me on that I always regretted was license branch reform that they opposed because they got a percentage or some stipend from license plate sales went to the state parties. I felt bad after, it's one vote I'd looked at over the years, and I wish I hadn't voted for that.
Okay.
Because that was at the then party chair's kind of demand. I was not a caucus leader at that time. Well, I guess I might have been the floor leader, the number 2 guy. Now, the caucus leadership puts a great deal of pressure on the caucus members to pass legislation.
Sure.
And some of that comes from, honestly, some of it comes from contributors, people who have been instrumental in putting a majority together. My philosophy was always, if it's good public policy and somebody you like wants it, great. If it's bad public policy and somebody you like wants it, or somebody you feel like you owe wants it, that can't be the dictating force. I'm not saying it isn't ever, but it shouldn't be. It needs to be good, and I've got plenty of examples that I'm not going to use because it'll point right to 1 or 2 people.
Right.
But it has to; those interests have to align. And if it's good public policy and it helps someone who's been supportive of you, you can prioritize that, in my view, and be sure it moves forward. If it's bad public policy, we got to I let those things go. I can't point to one that other than the license branch thing, that I can point to and say, oh, that was bad public policy and we supported it because somebody wanted it. Fortunately, with few exceptions, the governors that I've worked with had very similar aspirations for our state. Now, one I can think of that we crossed was with my good friend back to law school, Mike Pence, who wanted to adopt I always felt in preparation for whatever he was going to run for next, the same tax cuts that Kansas Governor Sam Brownback, who had the same campaign team, was advocating. And it was across the board. It was a 10% cut in income tax. It was cuts in sales, cuts in all kinds of taxes. And, we had set the state up for the next. My team had adopted, with the governor and the Senate and others, 15 tax cuts in 14 years. In fact, I just came across my tax cut timeline.
Oh, wow. Okay.
It showed all these.
Yeah.
And I just said to Governor Pence, no, we're not going to do this, and we're going to repeal the estate tax first, and then and you can't cut the lifeline of the state out just because it's good times, because there'll be bad times soon. And he hadn't been there to see that. I'd seen good times and bad times both.
Right.
Very difficult budget years, and I'd seen budget years where we put 10%, 10.5% more money into education. Yeah. So, I'd seen the high and the low, and Mike had not. And he was very upset about that. We gave him a 5% income tax cut phased in over a period of time, and he was really upset about that. But the vindicator was 2 years later, Kansas adopted the whole package. 2 years later, they came back and had to raise taxes because funding for education had tanked because of tax cuts. So it's good. I mean, there's a reason that there's a balance of power, separation of powers in Indiana, because your executives come in usually with short-term vision. Their term, maybe their second term. And some of the long-serving legislators have a much longer view. And when I became the leader, I said that, legislative long-term planning had been for years, gee, what bills are the Senate going to send over to us in the second half of the session? And instead, I said we need to look a decade down the road and see where we want Indiana to be, where we hope, what our aspirations are for our state 10 years from now. And every day make progress toward those goals. And we, in fact, did that. And that was where the agenda came in. And I had something like 72 items on my checklist, things that needed to be improved in Indiana. And we've hit almost all of those by the time I stepped away from the speakership.
Yeah. Okay. Wow.
The one that I never felt that we fully engaged on, one of those was make Indiana the Silicon Valley of the Midwest.
Okay.
And then right before I retired, there was a battery company coming to Franklin, I think, Indiana, Exide or somebody. And I was listening on the radio to the news, and they had the CEO on. It was the day after they had made the announcement. They were playing the CEO's remarks. He said, "We're coming to Indiana because Indiana is the Silicon Valley of the Midwest." Check mark.
There you go.
So I think there's a way to go before that's reality. But
right, yeah. Some signs perhaps for the future.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah. I guess when it comes to tax cuts, there's always a balancing act of making sure you don't do it too much where you can't fund general state procedures. Yeah, it's always a gamble, I guess, depending on how much you decide to do.
You have to plan it, and Indiana's done a very good job of it. I was a little concerned actually this year. Of course, my opinion means nothing anymore, but I shared with the two legislative leaders.
Yeah.
To be cautious about their tax cut plan, which the House was advocating. I actually spoke with Rob-Bray in the Senate. That times are great, the coffers are full. We got all this federal money that buoyed everything up, and so you got a lot of money in the till. But the times will change, and you're making permanent decisions of revenue cuts that you may regret later.
Yeah.
So when we had one of my Ways and Means chairman, Tim Brown, and before that, Jeff Esbeck, what we did when we had lots of money is we'd find one-time projects to fund rather than either upping the stream.
Okay. Yeah.
Yeah.
Wow.
So I would have that updated
That's
every year.
interesting.
Yeah. Just came across, again, I told you I was cleaning stuff out, so I just came across that. Dating back to the auto excise tax cut back in 95. This one just goes through 2015. I have one that goes through 2017. Exempting small businesses from personal property taxes, freezing farmland property taxes, paying $327 million in unemployment insurance taxes on behalf of companies, employers. But
Yeah.
we paid off record amount of debt during my tenure. And it wasn't just me, it was our governors, both Governor Pence and especially Governor Daniels. We had a mortgage burning for the state office building. We just paid off all kinds of outstanding debt, making us one of the lowest per capita debt states in the United States.
Yeah.
So that's where we tended to put excess money, or we paid cash for projects that would normally. And then you're permanently increasing the the expense stream, nor permanently decreasing the revenue stream. So, but as I say, the republic will survive. At least we hope so.
Yeah, that's right. Let's hope for the best. Yeah. Now, let's see. How influential were like lobbyists and stuff when you served in the General Assembly?
They are. It's got a bad name, of course.
Yeah.
Oh no.
Right.
But they are an essential source of information.
Mm-hmm.
And the legislature, of course, itself is part-time. We have limited research staff. We do have research staff, but it is not. It's not anywhere near what you see in some states or like in Congress or something like that, where they just got droves of people who are spending all kinds of time researching issues. So you have to rely on the lobby community for information. And we say lobbyists. Ooh, well, the Girl Scouts have a lobbyist. Taxpayer union has a lobbyist. The groceries have a lobbyist. The Small Business Association has a lobbyist. The beer wholesalers have a lobbyist. There's 1,000 different community organizations. Builders Association has a lobbyist. City and county government and township governments have lobbyists. So these people aren't. I know they're. You say the word, people cringe, but it's really folks who are providing information and advocacy for their clients. So now they're good lobbyists, which is the vast majority, and then there are some that you have to wonder about.
Okay.
And you learn pretty quickly who the ones are where they give you information and you got to double check it.
Yeah.
Good lobbyists will tell you, well, here's our position now. The opponents will tell you X.
Right.
The other side of the coin is this. Here's the downside, that kind of thing. So, but they are an essential part of the process. And really, if you didn't have, they're overregulated, and I get that. So I can remember early in my career coming into the parking lot and a lobbyist, an unnamed lobbyist, loading into an unnamed legislator a brand new set of golf clubs.
Wow.
And that was allowed because there were no rules against this. And one of my advocacies and ultimately achievements was to really tighten up our disclosure laws. To require anything over $50 in a day to you or your family or somebody or an employee to be reported. Now, there are some states that have no cup of coffee rules. You can't buy a cup of coffee. I think that's ridiculous because I buy my cups of coffee all the time. I buy business lunches, and if somebody's going to buy a business lunch, that's fine. If somebody's going to take somebody on a trip to Wisconsin to golf, I always discouraged. I never did it myself, and I always discouraged legislators and lobbyists from doing it. Allowed, but it has to be disclosed. So but they are, the vast majority of them are honorable, smart, informative people that are an essential portion of the process.
Do you think people who get sort of these larger gifts from lobbyists, do you think that they're influenced at all by that, or is it just kind of hint?
They claim not, but
Okay.
you got to wonder.
Yeah. Yeah.
And that's probably the Wisconsin, that was kind of an annual event, maybe twice a year. The Wisconsin golf event was the only one I really heard about and cringed.
Mm-hmm.
There was another one. There was a time when there was a standing open tab at one of the local establishments here that a lot of the legislators resided at, and I didn't even know about that one until I was there having a cocktail with a group, and somebody said, "Well, you want so and so to take care of that?" I said, "No." I said, "Well, they're taking care of everybody else in here." So I shined a light on that one pretty quickly.
Yeah.
And that came to a close as well. At least I hope it came to a close. Again, I have no authority now, so.
Right. Different position. Yeah.
Yeah.
How influential would you say like gerrymandering was when you served?
I drew maps in 2001 from the minority, and we actually made some changes. John Gregg and I together agreed to some changes to the majority's map. Drew them, of course, as the speaker in 2011.
Okay.
It has some impact. Let's see. The 2002 election, I think we had something like 58% of the vote and statewide and 48% of the legislators.
Mm-hmm.
And that's what I touted. Well, we won the majority in 2004, and that was only 4 years after the Democrats had gerrymandered maps. So national events honestly have a greater bearing, I think, than anything else. Now, I think part of the supermajority, there's some of it has to do with map drawing.
Yeah.
But part of the supermajority problem now is that is candidate recruitment. The Democrats have not done a great job of recruiting excellent candidates, and when they have recruited excellent candidates, generally they've won, even in districts that were uphill.
Yeah.
So I think it's more about the person, about their local influence in the community, and then national events. People don't like Donald Trump, that's a problem. People don't like Joe Biden, that's a problem. And will impact both legislative and congressional districts races, obviously, this fall.
Sure.
People's attitude about president. But it has some role.
Yeah.
Some role. And it makes what that doesn't mean there's no competition. It means the competition then is the primary.
Yeah.
And it becomes harder to do what somebody would call gerrymandering, or try to predetermine the election when so much of Indiana is rural and so much of the population is urban.
Yeah.
Right. So you have to draw these huge legislative districts in rural areas that are going to be Republican no matter who's running, just because of the people who live in rural communities. And the Democrat seats will be located in the urban areas like Indianapolis and Fort Wayne and South Bend.
Yep.
So, because that's where you draw them small.
Right.
And the federal, there's federal laws that regulate if you pack or crack, minority communities. And so there's no doubt it has some role, probably not the outsized role that some people think.
Yeah. Okay. So based on your experiences, with the legislative process for so many years, is there anything that you would change about the legislative process?
Well, I think the changes I wanted to do were implemented. More disclosure about, there's some people that, I don't know if there's anybody now, but during my leadership term, there were people who were lobbying in other states
Mm-hmm.
who had undisclosed to the public. I mean, we knew them, but undisclosed relationships with lobbyists that might be family members.
Okay.
And business relationships with family members that might not be disclosed and might be impacted by legislative action, like let's say nursing home legislation. And so we expanded greatly what had to be filled out and who was prevented from doing what. Put a 1-year cooling off period before somebody hit the lobbyist roles after they left the legislature. I suppose one thing that I would consider a reform that needs to happen is the those who don't fill a term, not by death, but because they step down, and then a replacement is selected by the precinct committeeman. That should probably be a special election. It is in many. It is in many states, but it's also expensive. I mean, a special election like that. Last time I asked, cost a local community $50,000.
Wow. Okay.
So I really can't think of any. I mean, I wish this is a wish, not a reform. I wish parties were able to get along better, and that some of the underlying tensions, whether it's racial or political or whatever it was, those would be soothed by some fashion. I sought to do that as much as I could as a leader of the chamber, but some things are just inherent.
Yeah.
But I can't think of any big reforms that should happen.
Right. Okay. Sure. Let's see. What would you say was like the most controversial legislative issue when you served?
Yeah, I'd say right to work. It had been introduced for many years. It was the primary reason that the Democrats walked out to Champaign-Urbana in 2011 and stayed there for 35 days, the longest legislative walkout in the nation's history. The National Conference of State Legislators confirmed that because previously it had been the 31 or 2 days that the Texas Republicans had walked out during redistricting in 2001. So they knew exactly what the number was. They had up to 14,000 union advocates, whether they were paid or volunteers is still a debate, that were protesting at the State House, many with nasty slogans on their signs with my name attached to them.
Wow, okay.
A couple hundred protesters at our residence out in Geist.
Yikes.
That was no doubt the most controversial. Also, the best thing that could happen for our state, the actual adoption of it, which we took off the table. They wanted school choice, charter schools, and right to work off the table, and a list of 10 other things.
Yeah.
Which I kept telling Pat Bauer that, the day you come back, the agenda is going to be exactly the same as it was. And they ultimately did come back after 35 days, and we took one item off the table, and that was right to work. And then knew that they could not walk out for any extended period of time in the following year. So we enacted it in 2012. So that would probably be the most controversial. There's one more, and that was the it was the marriage, the RIFRA. There we go. Restoration of Religious Freedom Restoration Act, RIFRA, which was actually, let's see, it was Mike Pence, so I think that was maybe 2016-ish. So we subsequently found out, first of all, the statute didn't do what was, it actually came out of 15 law school professors, most of whom were pro-gay marriage, who wanted Indiana law to be clarified as to when religious freedom and government action intersected, because Indiana case law was unclear in this regard.
Okay.
And so I looked at the law. I didn't see anything terribly wrong with it. It passed both houses. And then what we came to find out was there was this national alliance that was going to, there were 6 or 7 states that had this under consideration that year, 2016, I believe.
Mhm.
And North Carolina was getting ready to pass it, and they ran into some sort of parliamentary problem, and it got held up for 3 or 4 days, and we passed it first.
Okay.
And then Mike Pence had that signing party, which you may recall had
Mhm.
Jewish rabbis and Little Sisters of the Poor nuns and some well-known ultra-right advocates at it, and it just exploded
Yeah.
with a national explosion. That would equally be on the most controversial list. And then we spent, David Long and I got together and put together a compromise along with corporate leaders from around the state. Sit in my office, and we're talking about options, and we enacted a trail bill that allowed local communities to do what they're doing now, and that is to adopt a human rights ordinance if they desire to put folks that are whatever category they wanted to put into their non-discrimination ordinance that could do so. So that went on for weeks, was the subject of national attention.
Yeah.
So those would be the 2 that I would say during my term were the most controversial.
Okay. What about like the most complex?
Most complex. Well, that's probably going to be the record-breaking $30 billion road funding
Okay.
program that we adopted, I think, in 2018. I may be off by a year in all of these. That took years of advocacy, bringing people together. It was controversial because it had a 10-cent gas tax hike. I've never heard boo about that from anyone. At the time, there were a few tax advocacy groups that had not much in the way of following that were highly critical of it.
Interesting.
So gas tax hike displays good governance because it was a user fee that we adopted that only people who were using the roads are going to pay for it.
Right.
But it had a lot of moving parts. You had to decide what to do about electric cars. You had to decide what to do about people traveling through the state.
Yeah.
You had to decide where the money would go, how it would be used, and it was a multi-year and multifaceted piece of very important legislation. And I'd say it's probably the most complicated thing. Ed, he'd kill me. Holiday was the chairman of the Transportation Committee at the time and was the primary author of the bill. I was a secondary author to give it the imprimatur of the speaker as well, which carries some weight. So yeah, it was good stuff. And the other thing is, we had the street cred to have, and this is why we worked it up this way. We had the street cred to have a tax increase.
Right.
Because we had this record of 15 tax cuts over 14 years with no increases during that time. Cuts or eliminations, I should say, because we eliminated some taxes altogether. So that is where long-term planning, long-term vision, which generally comes from the legislative body rather than executives who are, there for a short period of time, is helpful.
Sure. Yeah, it makes sense. Let's see. So shifting gears a little bit to some like more specific questions. In the newspapers, I read that you appointed some Democrats to committee chair positions.
Yeah. Boy, that was a shocker.
Yeah.
So I always try to, the speaker gives, on organization day, the speaker gives a opening day speech, which I always, and sometimes it's simple, welcome back, we're going to get to work, buckle up. I usually viewed it as my opportunity to give the state of the state equivalent and set the tone. I've got copies of each one that I gave over the years because I'd write it out in full and make notes of it, let the staff fool around with it as well. And I always like to have a gasp in there someplace. We're going to do this. Have a gasp come from the crowd. So I did speaker once, and 2005, 2006, and then had 4 years as minority leader, which is really somewhat unprecedented because usually if you lose the majority, your caucus chucks that person and moves on to the next.
Right.
But I, worked through with our team, and everybody knew that the items that beat us, the toll road and daylight savings time, were important for Indiana's future. So when I was re-elected as Speaker in 2010, I had decided that I was going to try to really exemplify bipartisanship and try to. You asked what needed to change. Said that bipartisanship had gotten a lot shallower because of the 250-50 experiences and the campaigns, et cetera. So I contacted, after winning the election, I contacted two of the more conservative Democrats, one in leadership, Chet Dobas, who was the Speaker pro tempore for several Democrat speakers.
Yeah.
Boy, his name's going to escape me now. He's from Jeffersonville, businessman. Occasionally cast a vote with us in the minority, and was viewed as a conservative. I called them both, tried to get them to switch parties.
Okay.
Because there were in that election nationwide, there were quite a few Democrat switches in the legislature in other states. So I called both of these guys, and Steve was the other guy's name. It's escaping me. Anyway, I called them both, asked if they wanted to change parties, and they both said no, which can't, and not going to do it. And I said, well, I tell you what, I'm considering appointing a couple of Democrats as committee chairs. Would you be willing to do that? And they both said yes. So it will not be easy because there'll be people on both sides that don't like it.
Right.
So I told my leadership team, but not our caucus. My leadership team of 6, maybe 8 of top leaders in our caucus, and cleared it with them, and they gave the pros and cons, and some were for it and some were against it. I said, well, I'm doing it. So I announced that toward the end of my speech, I said, and I'd like to announce that there are going to be 2 Democrat committee chairs. I'll be appointing 2 Democrats as committee chairs. And there was just this, from the membership.
Oh my gosh.
On both sides.
Yeah.
Republicans were shocked. It had never happened in our state then 194-year history. No one had ever appointed a person from the other side as a committee chair. And so there were people that were upset because that means there were going to be 2 Republicans that wouldn't be committee chairmen.
Right.
Pat Bauer was upset that I hadn't asked him first who he would recommend, and he called it a stick in the eye.
Yeah.
It wasn't bipartisan, it was a stick in the eye. But it worked out fairly well. Again, I kind of appointed people, their vice chairman, to be their close watchers. And I always had a committee chairman meeting. It was then political strategy, usually. Well, the tone of that had to change with the 2 Democrats in there. I did it again. Chet Dobas left the legislature. I did it again with Steve, whatever his name is. And it just didn't work. So it was an experiment that I didn't appoint anybody. Then the 4th year after that, I just stuck with all Republican. I called Steve first and said, this just didn't work out.
Right.
Because the committee chairman, I mean, they can decide which bills move forward.
Right. What gets heard
all
or not.
kinds of things. It was not. It was an experiment that was tried that wasn't the best. But yeah, so I got to tell you a story. So I go to the National Speakers Conference. In 2012, and there's a roundtable of speakers of the House, Republican and Democrat. This is in like Nome, Alaska, or someplace. And the Alaska speaker is running this and saying, well, what does everybody want to talk about? There were 2 or 3 topics. And I said, I'd like to talk about how we expand bipartisanship in our legislative bodies. I appointed 2 representatives of the minority party as Democrat chairs, and Greg Chenault, I think is his name, that was the Speaker Chenault out of Alaska says, "Well, I would never do that, not in a million years," and just moved on. Didn't let anybody else speak, moved on. So that's why I met my friend, Mississippi Speaker, who still is Mississippi Speaker, Phil Gunn, who came up. I had met him before. He comes up to me after, he said, "Speaker Bosma, I want you to know, I saw what you did." He said, "And I did it too."
Yeah.
And I said, "Well, why didn't you say something?" He goes, "Oh, I'm not getting out in front of that." So there were. I found out later that there were one or two other speakers of the House in other states that had seen that announcement and thought, well, that's really great. I'm gonna try it too. I have no idea how anybody else's experiment went.
Yeah.
So that was interesting.
Yeah, I bet that must have been an experience for sure.
It was.
I also saw that you create, I guess, like the nation's first statewide voucher program for low-income students or something.
Yes. Yep. I'd say that on the list of things, not most controversial, although that would have to go on that list also, but most important.
Yeah.
I would list that one as one of the most important legislative efforts I was involved in, and I was really the principal advocate in the legislature behind it. I was actually the co-author because Representative Bob Baining, who was the chair of the Education Committee, had advocated it for so long. It wouldn't have passed with just his advocacy, but the speaker has some imprimatur, as I said earlier, that they can get things done. So we got that through 2011. That was one of the things that the Democrats walked out over. But once they came back, we knew we had the votes for it. And I've been around education my entire life, around educators my entire life, served for a couple of years with the I mentioned. And I have been thanked by low-income families, a lot of minority, for that revision more than anything else I've done, because I had moms and dads crying, saying we never thought we could give our children the kind of education we wanted them to have at Heritage Christian or Roncalli or St. Barnabas, wherever it may be, private school. And it's made, and my hope for it was that it would create competition also, because we had done all these regulatory attempts to improve public education. Most of them sticks, some carrots, but I was a firm believer that competition could change things. And I remember being at a Lawrence, one of those meetings I would go to as the legislator. You asked how we knew, what people wanted. I went to always a couple times a year. I'd go to the Lawrence Township Parent Teacher Association meeting, PTA, and up where we lived and where I represented. And I remember the superintendent at the time, it's not Dr. Smith who's there today, it was somebody before him, telling the teachers, I was sitting at a teacher meeting first, I said, look, school choice is here. We've got to compete. We have to up our game. We have to be better. We have to be more attractive. We have to have better results. And I thought, I didn't say it, but I had a giant bubble above my head saying, this is just what I'd hoped for. And that didn't mean there weren't people that weren't upset about it. There were plenty of them. Again, ISTA poster boy, right? Yeah. On the negative post, on the dartboard. Yeah. But it's important for families.
Interesting. Now, I heard you mention a lot about like the 88 session and then the other split session. Did you find it like good for getting legislation done, or was it a mess? Terrible? Okay.
It was awful. So we didn't have the state constitution doesn't provide for a split 50-50.
Yeah.
So I wasn't in leadership in the 88 one. I was in the 96 one or whatever the second one was. They had to make up rules. And what they did was they had we call them stereo speakers. Mike Phillips, the Democrat, would be the speaker one day, then Paul Manweiler would be the speaker the next day. There were co-committee chairmen. Every co-committee chairman had 5 bills would pass on a divided vote out of committee. And then there would be 5 get out of committee free cards, and then 10 for Ways and Means where I was serving. It was just, what one side did the other side undid the next day, and it was a mess. That we passed all kinds of legislation, and the Senate wasn't having anything to do with it. So it was the 88 session was a waste. That was also, I called that the Boonville Death March.
Okay.
Maybe that was the next session, the Boonville Death March, because Mike Phillips was from Boonville. We met all day, every day, except most Sundays. You met on some Saturdays through Valentine's Day, and in a short session, and passed hundreds of bills, and none of them became law. The Senate deep sixed them all. So yeah, the Boonville Death March.
Interesting. Okay. Let's see. So how would you summarize your time then overall serving the General Assembly?
You know, it was the experience of a lifetime. The opportunity to serve others, to improve lives, to improve our state's economy.
Yep.
I had a list. I started out with the 2002 list of where we were last in all of these national ratings, literally last, or 45th. And I was just looking at them again, through this cleanup. And then I kept a list about what's great about Indiana. I had the staff keep the list about what's great in Indiana. And, we were number one in lost jobs in technology. Prior to 2004, we were last in the percentage of our workforce that was in, so I can still give the speech, last in the percentage of our workforce that was in professional management or administrative positions. Number one in bankruptcies in the nation, Indiana was.
Gosh.
And yeah, and then this must have been from a speech I gave. It's 2002, group set out 2004. We got our chance. We pledged honestly balanced budgets, eliminate crushing debt and pension liabilities, make our state the place to work, live, and build a business, streamline government, free business through deregulation, 13 tax cuts then in 13 years, 68% less debt than 2005, fully funded pensions in Indiana, AAA rating with all three rating agencies, stepping to the lowest corporate income tax in the nation, lowest personal income tax among 41 states with one. And then I've got all these number one. Indiana ranks first in the Midwest, fifth in the nation in Chief Executive Magazine's annual Best and Worst States survey. First in the Midwest, eighth nationally in Area Development's top states for doing business. First in the Midwest, eighth nationally in the Tax Foundation's Business Tax Climate for 2017. First in the Midwest, fifth in the nation for Best Business Climate and Business Facilities 2016 state rankings. First in the nation for Education Reform's 2015 Parent Power Index. Seventh in the nation in the Small Business and Entrepreneurship Council's Small Business Policy Index for 2017. Third in the nation as the best place to do business in the Polina Corporate Real Estate 2015 Top Pro Business States. Sixth in the nation for Economic Outlook and Alex 2016 Rich States, Poor States. First in the nation for having the best state government in U.S. News and World Report list of best states. The Democrats got so tired of hearing me say that all the time.
Yeah.
Because I took real pride in that. We were there. I was there. I was the only consistent leader because the governor changed 3 times.
Yeah.
The Senate leadership had changed. I was the only leader present for all of these things. This dramatic move from last in the nation in so many areas to first in the Midwest and first in the nation in many of those. I don't take all the credit for it, but I do take credit for keeping people focused on a goal.
Right.
And doing what I said early on was always my goal. Look a decade or 20 years down the road, try to figure out where we want Indiana to be, which was at the top of these lists, not the bottom. And make strides every year, every legislative session to try to get there. So, I'd have our staff, Tyler Campbell, our other research, Jeff Spalding, our other research people, keep me posted on all of these constantly. When a list would come out like that, why are we 15th in the charter list of best charter school states, and we became first on that list. It's not on this list. I must have been talking to somebody that might not have thought charter schools was a great idea, because the list ultimately made 2 pages.
Yeah.
And I honestly take great pride in that. And if there's something I can point to say, well, what did you accomplish in your 34 years of public service? I would say that list.
Right.
And it's kind of like, will we stay there? It's kind of like Ben Franklin's comment after the Constitutional Convention. Somebody on the street asked him, well, what have we got? And he says, a republic if you can keep it.
Yeah.
So, we're I don't know where we are on these lists today. This list is 3-4 years old. But hopefully we'll have leaders, and I'm confident we do, that will continue to try to put economic success for Hoosiers, educational success for Hoosiers,
Sure,
tax comfort for Hoosiers,
yep,
at the top, very top of their list, and along with so many other issues that are of importance. But that's the original. This is another thing my dad said. The original Department of Health, Education, and Welfare is a good job. And
sure,
that's what it's about. It's about people being able to have a good job so they can do what they want to do. They can raise a family that they want to raise. They can be successful, get the education for their kids that they would like to have. And so I feel very fulfilled. I guess I shouldn't even say proud. I feel fulfilled.
Yeah.
In that regard, that we were able to accomplish these things and together. And a lot of people get credit. And which is also why it was time for me to retire. 2 things, really. One, I was having difficulty coming up with my next list of things that needed to change. And, when I made my retirement announcement, I got a gasp out of that one, too. Then I said it was time for the next, I made a list of 72 items back in 2002 and 2004. It's time for somebody else to make their list and to put it in effect. Plus, my staff said I wasn't having fun anymore. And I said, yeah, you're right. I'm getting a little tired of the Hubbub-ery. So.
Right. No, I understand. Let's see. So last couple of questions before you have to go then. So what advice would you give to future legislators or even current legislators?
Yeah, I gave a lot of advice along the way, particularly in the closing year, knowing that I didn't know exactly when I was stepping out, but I knew it wasn't far off. So I spent a lot of time every session with the new people and trying to encourage them. And frequent advice I would give was twofold. First of all, walk across the aisle, make a friend in the other party, or more. Hopefully somebody you serve on some committees with, somebody you can get to know, somebody you can go to lunch with, so you have a contact on the other side. Yep. And you may find that that's really aids your and their success when you have a person from the other party that you can go to and say, hey, I'm thinking about this. What do you think? What do you think the reaction of your colleagues will be? And the second one was to develop an area of expertise. Try to be the person when somebody would come to me and say, well, how do I get in leadership? And how do I become whatever, speaker or chairman? Yeah. You have to be a person that when you get up to speak on something, people say, I want to know what Representative X is thinking about this, right. Or they look to see how you're voting on an issue. So it's pretty much usually got to be in your committee assignments. You need to develop expertise. You need to read everything you can, everything that comes through that committee. Read every word of every bill, and if you don't understand it, ask somebody who does, and try to be that person who people say, wow, if he's got that opinion, I'm listening, first of all, and I think I'm going to change my vote because so-and-so has recommended that. Yeah. So those would be 2 pieces of advice. I know I've come up with more for national publications, that kind of thing.
Sure. No, I understand. So then my last question is,
what do you want the people of Indiana to know about their influence on the General Assembly?
Well, first of all, that the people really do have influence. When people come together, signing a petition and mailing it in means nothing.
Right.
Speaking with your legislator or writing a heartfelt letter like the person did whose father of her child was a rapist in prison.
Right. Yeah.
That gets your attention and causes you to, stop and think, causes a legislator to stop and think. So I also frequently tell people that want to have an influence to get to know your legislator. Go to a fundraiser, not so you write a check to them, but so you meet them in person, or go to a meeting where you know they're going to be and introduce yourself and thank them for their service. And, don't automatically have some request first thing and every time you see them, but see them in a visit with them in a circumstance where you don't need something or you don't want to ask them to support something. Then when the time comes, when you do want them to support something, you go to them and say, hey, look, I don't like to bother you, but here's what I'm thinking on this issue. Where do you stand?
Yeah.
Hey, I've left one of my quote achievements out. So I opened the chamber to full vision on the internet in 2005 and 6. Others had done. I mean, John.
It was like live streamed. Yeah.
This was honest to goodness live stream.
Yeah.
And then when I came back in 2010 for my second speakership, one of my stated goals was to open every committee room also to live stream, and they all were.
Yeah, that's cool.
So I was asked once by Jim Shella what I thought my legacy would be, and I said I thought my legacy was that I'd opened the chamber so that somebody could sit at home and watch what was going on, didn't have to go downtown. His response was, well, it's pretty early to be talking about legacy. Okay, Ben, thanks.
Bye-bye. Thank you.